Once again, welcome everyone. A few housekeeping notes before we start. Please have your camera off and the mics muted. There will be a Q&A session after the talk. Feel free to post questions in the chat box to Yubing directly. Also, this webinar will be recorded and posted online. Before we begin, here is a short video of Professor Karplus' new book, Spinach on the Ceiling, the Multifaceted Life of a Theoretical Chemist. Good morning. Today, we're very fortunate to have Professor Martin Karplus with us. We also welcome Professor John Straub to moderate today's session. Professor Straub is a professor of chemistry at Boston University. He received his bachelor's degree in chemistry from the University of Maryland, where he worked with Muller Alexander, and his PhD in chemical physics from Columbia University, where he worked with Bruce Byrne. He was an NIH postdoc fellow at Harvard University, where he worked with Martin Karplus before joining the faculty of Boston University in 1990. His research explored the dynamics and thermodynamics of proteins, membranes, and complex molecular assemblies, including amyloid protein aggregation. He has served as president of Telluride Science Research Center, as Phi Beta Kappa National Visiting Scholar, and is an associate editor of the Journal of Chemical Physics. He's also the author of the recently published book, Mathematical Methods for Molecular Science. And now I'd like to hand it over to Professor Straub.
Well, thank you so much, Yubing. Well, it is a real honor for me to serve as moderator today and a pleasure to introduce Professor Martin Karplus, who has many distinctions, including being the author of Spinach on the Ceiling, the Multifaceted Life of a Theoretical Chemist. For decades, Martin has been one of the most talked about individuals in science among Karplusians, the more than 250 of us that had the pleasure to work in Martin's group, and non-Karplusians alike. And I think this was true in part because of what we knew and in part what we did not know. So what was known was discussed. Martin's many seminal contributions to science, including the Karplus equation and NMR, reaction kinetics of H plus H2, theories of protein folding and allostery, and the molecular dynamics of biomolecular systems. We discussed the science and its creation and its impact. And what was not known was discussed. When would Martin receive the Nobel Prize? Unlike many scientists that receive that distinction, not one but many scenarios were mentioned. A prize for contributions to the field of NMR before Ernst was recognized. A prize for contributions to protein dynamics, perhaps with Hans Frauenfelder. A prize for molecular dynamics, possibly with Joshua Jortner and Ahmed Zewail before Zewail was recognized, and more. That question was finally answered in 2013. But there were other questions. Was Martin investigated by the FBI? And if so, why? Martin was hired to the faculty at Illinois with no journal publications in chemistry. What transpired in those years at Caltech with Linus Pauling and in England with Charles Coulson? Martin co-authored the wonderful book Atoms and Molecules with Richard Porter, but it was rumored that there were notes for another book. Would that be published in the future? Martin had established a tradition of changing institutions every 5 years. He seemed poised to leave Harvard for France in the 1970s. Why did he stay at Harvard? What happens during the summer when Martin is away in France? And many other questions. In Spinach on the Ceiling, these questions and many more are answered. While biographies of great scientists are common, autobiographies are relatively rare. That makes this book and this moment of special significance. Martin, we look forward to your remarks and our discussion.
Thank you very much, John, for this introduction, and Sue Law for making this event possible. Why did I write this autobiography? First, to try to inspire young people, particularly students in science, by showing that even I met difficulty in my research, and importantly, that the faith I had in myself permitted me to overcome these difficulties. A striking case in point is the events and research that led to the Nobel Prize. I propose to extend studies made in the 60s of the simplest chemical reaction, that of a hydrogen atom with a hydrogen molecule, which involves only 3 atoms, to biological macromolecules, such as proteins and DNA, which may involve hundreds to thousands of atoms. My chemistry colleagues said that such calculations would be meaningless, given the difficulty of doing accurate studies of reactions involving only a few molecules. And my biology colleagues said, even if we could do it, they wouldn't be interested in our results. Clearly, history has shown both to be wrong, or I wouldn't be here today. The lesson that I want a student to take away from this is that if they have important problems that they want to work on, they should have enough faith in themselves that they will go ahead and do it in spite of the fact that they might get criticisms from other people in related areas. Now, they should, however, keep in mind that sometimes these criticisms may be correct, and they should go on to something else. So it's a fine line that one is following in trying to do what you feel is most important. Second, I hope that my autobiography would bear witness to future generations of what happened in Austria during the Nazi period. As the then mayor, Heupel, said when he inducted me as an honorary citizen of Vienna, let me quote, "We cannot undo what happened, but we will do our best to not let it happen again." So I hope that this autobiography will play a part in this remembrance. And finally, I wanted to write the autobiography to remind myself of how lucky I had been to be here today, and to let my children know what my life was like, which we discussed some, but it was better to have it written down. Now, let me read a few passages from my autobiography. It may take me a little time to find them, but the first concerns, of course, where the title comes from. Then there was the famous spinach incident. Mitzi, who was our maid, told me that I must eat my spinach. Popeye did not exist in Austria, but unfortunately spinach did. With all the vehemence I could muster, I took a spoonful of the spinach and then threw it at the ceiling. The spinach remained visible on the ceiling for a long time and was pointed out at appropriate moments when my parents wanted to indicate what a naughty child I was. Another thing I might be nice to read about is that when we were children in Austria, before the Nazi times, we had a large extended family of 20 or more people with children the same ages as my brother Robert and myself. We would regularly spend the summer together, either in a lake in Austria or in a house that sometimes we rented on the Adriatic coast. Now, it was during one of these summers in the early 30s where the following event happened. One day at the beach, a friend of my parents picked me up and cuddled me, much to my dismay. I yelled out, "Ich bin ein Nazi," I'm a Nazi, which so shocked her that she dropped me. Clearly, I had somehow realized, presumably from listening to my parents and others, that being a Nazi was the worst possible thing to be. Now, as people who have looked at the autobiography know, I spent a lot of time working in restaurants, in famous restaurants. And one of the experiences was in working in the restaurant of Joel Robuchon. He was a 3-star chef, as there were about 20 others in France at the time, but he was considered to be the 3-star chef. And so after I had spent my stage in the restaurant, it had been so nice that I decided to invite Marcy to come down from Strasbourg to Paris and that we would have a dinner there. And if I can find it, here. As my stage was nearing its end, it had been so special that I thought it would be nice to finish by having lunch there with Marcy. I waited to request the reservation until a few days before. So not surprisingly, when I asked the maître d', he said he was sorry, but the restaurant was fully booked. However, he came back a little while later and said he had managed to find a table for us. Presumably, Robuchon had intervened. Marcy had arrived from Strasbourg by train that morning, and we were ushered to a well-situated table with a bottle of champagne and a cooler waiting for us. Marcy's menu did not have any prices. This was not in itself unusual in elegant restaurants where only the host had a price. However, mine did not list any prices either. I pointed this out to Marcy and asked her, what should I do? She said, well, it's pretty clear to me what's going on. Robuchon is inviting us. It was a wonderful and gracious luncheon, at the end of which the maître d' escorted us to Robuchon's private sitting room, where we had coffee and cognac with him and chatted for a while. about both his problems with having everything perfect. He was a chef who would only allow people to use a new recipe if he had written it out in detail, sort of like the guide to doing a chemical reaction, of course, which in certain cases it really was. After we returned to Strasbourg, I sent him a special bottle of eau de vie de Troyes, Par brandy, for which Alsace was famous. He in turn sent me a letter thanking me, which is shown in the book. Robuchon was clearly not only a great chef, but also a real gentleman. And finally, I want to describe an experience which resonates in a certain way with what is happening today in the United States. My parents had given me their old car as a graduation present. And several times during my Caltech career, I drove across the country to our home in Newton, Massachusetts. This was when I was a graduate student with Linus Pauling at Caltech. Each time I took a different route, once through Canada, visiting Banff and Jasper National Parks, and another time through the deep south. On one such trip, that went in the south, while driving through Texas, on a very hot summer day, my friends and I decided to take a swim and cool off. We passed one designated swimming area that was full of people. Because we were unshaven and dirty from a long drive, we looked along the river for a quiet place to swim. About a mile downstream, we came across another swimming area with broken down steps leading to the water. As it was deserted, we decided that was the perfect place for us to swim. After we'd been in the water for about 10 minutes, a couple of pickup trucks drove up and several men jumped out with guns at the ready. They turned out to be the local law enforcement officers. They ordered us out of the water and demanded to know what we thought we were doing. White folks swimming in an area reserved for niggers, as they said. They had noticed the Massachusetts license plate on the car and had concluded that we were northern troublemakers. After some effort, we succeeded in explaining that, given our scruffy state, we had just not wanted to bother other white people. The officers let us go with the admonition that we had better drive straight through Texas without stopping anywhere, which we did. Now, very recently, I came across a statement in a book I've been reading, which is called Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. It's a profound description of the role of race in America today. She describes the role of the purity of water in the prejudice against African Americans. Whites were shot for going into pools reserved for African Americans, as well as the reverse. So really, we were lucky to be able to get away. Now, in thinking of somehow a discussion of my autobiography seems in some way not relevant, given the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, both for the event itself and for the danger her replacement poses for the future of our country. Actually, I met Justice Ginsburg under rather special conditions. Once the Nobel Prize of 2013 was announced, I was invited to a gala dinner at the house of the Swedish ambassador in Washington, D.C., where I had already been because Obama, unlike our present president, invited American Nobel Prize winners to his residence. When I sat down to dinner, I discovered that my two neighbors on the left and right were Justice Ginsburg on the left and the recently appointed head of the Federal Reserve, Janet Yellen. I could not have had better dinner companions. I asked Justice Ginsburg about a pending case before the Supreme Court, and not surprisingly, she answers that she could not discuss it. Then, since I was a guest of honor, the conversation turned to the questions about my life. She was especially interested to learn about my background, that I had come to the US when I was 8 years old, in 1938 as a refugee from Nazi Austria. I also mentioned the 2006 Spinach article, the initial source from which the present autobiography began. And I subsequently sent a copy to Justice Ginsburg. She wrote back that she looked forward to reading it, but that she would have to wait until the end of the term because she was busy with upcoming cases. I recently learned from the news that her father had come from Odessa, which is the same place as my grandfather came from. And also that she was left-handed, just like me. Now, interestingly, she had been forced to write by some teacher with her right hand, but being as stubborn as she was and is known to be in terms of her testimony before the Supreme Court, she decided she would ignore what he asked her to do and continue to write with her left hand. Unlike her, I took my teacher's advice, and so I write with my right hand, avoiding what she sort of has to do with and has to write in this way. If you're writing in a Western European language, if you write in Hebrew, you'd actually be in the correct position to do that. So this is a memory that will stay with me for a long time. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Martin, for those wonderful remarks. Again, we welcome your questions. Please send those in the chat box to Yubing. And Martin, I'll start with a question. One of my favorite elements of your book is the footnotes, which I think are quite rich in content and contain many interesting anecdotes. And in a footnote on page 100, you mention in the context of discussing your book, Atoms and Molecules, that you had in mind writing two other books. One is discussed in that footnote. And I wonder if you could say a few words about the other.
One that's discussed in the footnote, I think, is that I worked for many years on revising Pauling's book, which is a famous book. And he had given me the opportunity to revise it, thinking that I would just make a few corrections to bring it up to date. But I couldn't work on it in that way. And so I went through chapter by chapter. And finally, Pauling said, well, if I wanted to do this, this would be another book. And so that ended that attempt. Now, the book that is not referred to is one that I was working on with Bill Reinhardt on many body theory.
Ah.
And we got quite far along on this book. Actually, in some sense, it was the beginning of my going to 3-star restaurants, because we spent the summer in Geneva working on it. And then I'd heard of Père B's, the famous restaurant in Annecy, where I finally also work. And so we went there to have a wonderful luncheon. And I still have the notes somewhere in the cabinet, but I don't think I will ever finish it.
I see. Well, thank you. We have a question from the audience that is, where do you visualize multi-scale models for complex chemical systems are heading to, almost a century after the advent of quantum mechanics and with the exciting prospects of quantum computing on the horizon?
Well, this, judging from the past, which is always a good way to try to get an idea of the future. If you look at simulations of macromolecules, they have improved and been better able to understand what actually happens as computer power has increased. And what was a huge computer that we use is now basically available on an iPhone. And so as the computer power will increase with quantum computing, which at the moment is more a dream than reality as far as I can tell, it is likely that we will be able to, in one way, get to the stage of being able to actually simulate with a variety of methods how cells operate, being able to calculate in sufficient time to get to the time scale of the actual events in the cell, which will give us a much better understanding what is really going on, whether simulations will go on to studying organs. I probably won't be here to see that, but I wouldn't be surprised if it happens. Actually, there have been some simulations of protocells, so the beginning, the cells which would have had sort of the minimal information and composition that was necessary to pass on genetic information. And there, I've actually written a lecture in which I try to predict at what stage we would be able to study these various possibly interesting things. And for the protocell, it was my prediction that we would be able to simulate the whole life cycle, which is on the order of minutes, maybe in 2030. Given quantum computing, maybe we'll be able to do it sooner.
Well, that's a great vision of the future, and 2030 is not that far away. We have a question that I think is quite interesting, and maybe particularly for younger developing scientists from the audience, that is, have you ever needed to balance pursuing risky big ambitions that might take time to achieve against needing to maintain momentum with more achievable goals?
Well, I was very lucky to have this group of 250 Karplusians, which have already been mentioned. And at the stage when I was much younger, my group had as many as 40 students, which I can't imagine having had and knowing everyone what they were doing at any given time. And so I was able, in terms of what the questioner wanted to know, to be able to have students continue to work on problems which were relatively well defined, while I could take the time to investigate new areas to see whether I might be able to make a contribution. One of these areas actually was the brain, and now maybe 20 years ago or more, I was interested in seeing whether I could make a contribution to our understanding of how the brain works. And I spent about 2 years going to meetings, reading books and such, and concluded that that I couldn't do anything that would be useful. Meanwhile, as I mentioned earlier, the students were working on problems, chemical reactions and biomolecules, where I could keep track of things. And so that, first of all, publications could continue. And I realized, that in the future of a student, having good publications was a very important part to make it possible for them to find a good job. But I decided that, studying the brain at that time was not, well, that I could not do anything was useful. Nowadays, in fact, in recent years, I've been able to return to this problem, not for studying the human brain, but studying the brain of a very simple system, which has a very well defined brain, which is in fact defined purely by genetics, unlike our brain, where genetics certainly plays a role, but one knows that as identical twins, they may develop very differently. Well, this little worm, C. elegans, has a brain that is hardwired, and every C. elegans has exactly the same so-called brain. Has only about 300 elements and connections. And So it's a great system to study. And what we found out is that with Sergei Krylov, the methods we used for studying protein folding could be applied to understanding C. elegans.
Well, that's very intriguing and fascinating. Thank you. We have a question that speaks to the earlier chapters in your book. How did your family manage to escape Nazi Austria in 1938? Did you get help from the United States? And how did your life as a refugee shape your life as a chemist? And maybe there's a brief follow-up which is related, which is, do you experience now discrimination against Jews in the United States? So.
In terms of leaving Austria, we didn't, well, did we receive help from the United States? In a certain sense, what we needed to come to the United States was to have a visa. And we were fortunately able to obtain this visa. The United States had a very restrictive policy on immigrants, which, again, in the present era, it has as well. If you wanted to come to the United States, you had to have somebody who could guarantee that you would not become a ward of the state, require support. Unfortunately, one of my uncles, Edward Karplus, worked for a company which made the Variac, which I think is still used to adjust the voltage for experiments. He invented it, actually, my uncle. And the head of this company, Mr. Eastman, offered an affidavit, as it was called, which was basically that he would guarantee that if we came to the United States, we would be taken care of. So given that, we were able to obtain a visa and came to the United States together. In terms of escaping from Austria, actually, what happened there is we left Austria early enough in 1938. In fact, we left Austria 2 days after Hitler was welcomed into Austria. My parents had been aware of what was going on and had made reservations for a ski vacation in Switzerland. And my mother, my brother, and I took a train there shortly after my birthday, which was on March 15th. And the only problem was that my father was put into jail, into the Viennese jail. And he was only released after he had signed over all our property to the Nazis. And my mother said, don't worry, we'll all be able to go to the United States together. And we believed her. I'm sure, actually, that she was very worried about what would happen to my father. But circumstances that are not completely clear, he was released from jail after we had gotten our visa, and we met together in Le Havre, where we took a boat to the United States. Now, the other part of the question was, how did this affect what life was like here in the United States? And have I ever been subjected to anti-Semitism? Let me just answer the second part of the question so that maybe other questioners would have a chance to ask questions. I personally don't think I've ever been affected by anti-Semitism. There were restrictions, which my uncle, the one I mentioned before, who arranged for our affidavit, had when he was living in Belmont, and he didn't allow us to visit him for a long time, or when we visited, I guess that we had to not talk while we were coming in to visit them so that the neighbors wouldn't know that he was a foreigner and maybe was Jewish. But unfortunately, finally, anti-Semitism is still prevalent in Austria. And one of the reasons why when I go to Europe, I don't go back to Austria except for special occasions. And we do often summer in France, where we have a small chalet in the countryside. So yes, anti-Semitism does still affect our life, but in terms of my career, as far as I can tell, there never really has been an effect on it.
Thank you. We have a question that says, we know you are a fantastic chef. Are your recipes available for others?
Well, the short answer is no. The longer answer is, my son Misha and I cook a lot together and have put together a recipe book, which we have. He's a very good baker, which I am not, because I don't like following recipes exactly. And when you're doing baking, you really have to do that. So there is this recipe book, which has about 200 or so pages, which we use for ourselves and use in the family. I have thought about, maybe one would publish it. There are other books by famous scientists which discuss cooking.
That would be wonderful.
But for the
With
moment,
Misha, it's our co-author.
but for the moment, he doesn't feel he should really do that. So
that's great. Thank you. There's a question on perspective on science. Quantum chemists have worked on biological problems extensively. Why do you think they have, by and large, stayed out of problems that have consumed condensed matter physicists, like the theory of superconductivity?
why chemists have?
Why quantum chemists have been very interested in biology and, of course, now in aspect of materials, but certain problems like theory of superconductivity that have been central to condensed matter physics, also quantum problems, not as much interest on the part of quantum chemists.
Well, I think superconductivity is so different from the role of quantum mechanics in chemistry that, I mean, there's really, I would say, almost no relationship. And if they were interested in superconductivity, they wouldn't have become chemists, they would have become physicists. And, you know, even the role of quantum mechanics in chemistry is relatively small. I mean, it has to do with determining the interactions between the atoms of which the molecules are composed, as in the H plus H2 reaction mentioned earlier. And then there are, of course, processes where that cannot be treated by regarding the atoms as particles interacting with certain forces, where the atomic structure changes, like the visual pigment, where light interacts with the electronic structure of the atoms, and their quantum mechanics is necessary. But again, the short answer would be that what they do, what the quantum chemists do, really has no overlap with the study of problems like superconductivity.
Let me just ask a brief, well, maybe brief follow-up. You mentioned your interest in neural cognition and neuronal systems. Do you see a role for quantum phenomena in cognition?
Well, certainly in vision, which is part of cognition, they're clearly, you know, the excitation of the retinal chromophore plays an important role. And there, you know, quantum mechanics has to be brought in.
Great, all right, thank you. There's a question from David Clary in Oxford. You were a postdoc with Charles Colson at Oxford quite early in your career. Was that an important time for you?
It was an important time, but not because of my being a postdoc in Charles Coulson's group. He proposed problems to me that I thought were really only of interest to other quantum chemists. And what I wanted to do was to solve problems that were of interest to chemists as a whole. And so while I was there, I really did almost nothing that he suggested for me to do, and rather by talking, Don Hornig was there, Price was there in physics. I looked around during this period for what I could do that I thought would be of interest to chemists. And I realized that NMR, which was just beginning to be applied to chemical problems by people like Herb Gutowski and Charlie Schlichter, was an area where I thought I could really make contributions. And so I decided then that I would apply to the University of Illinois. Well, actually, it's more complicated, but the interaction with Coulson, well, I thought he was a very nice person, but in terms of doing things with him rather than using the time for finding out what I would want to do when I went to work was really limited. He also had an interesting view of science and religion. He was a very religious Methodist, I guess. And he described that as two sides of a mountain. Now, it did turn out that when I returned, I was at Harvard and was interested in vision and was working on polyenes, which are the retinal chromophore that absorbs the light. And there it turns out that the sort of Paris and methods like Coulson used actually turned out to be useful. So yes, the period was very important in my future. It was where I decided to study NMR, from which the Karplus equation, which has already been mentioned, arose. But in terms of the direct interaction with Coulson, it did not play a role in my future. In fact, maybe I mentioned one other thing that I mentioned. I went to the University of Illinois. And how did that happen? Well, I guess you mentioned it already, that thanks to a recommendation of Pauling, that they hired me without ever having seen me or having interviewed me the way nowadays schools have an extended courtship before they hire a new assistant professor.
Great, thank you. So another remarkable and influential scientist, Steve Berry of the University of Chicago, recently passed away, and he was a contemporary of yours at Harvard College. You had other things in common. You were best boy in the Westinghouse Science Talent Search in 1947, and Steve was a finalist the following year. In the book, we read about your life as a chef, but Steve once told me a story also involving food, that when you were undergraduates, there were eating contests that were held and that you fared very well. And I have an interest in this question, and we received a similar question posed. Are the stories about hot dog eating contests true?
Well, the story in terms of Steve Berry involved not hot dog, but rather going to Durgan Park, a restaurant that I think was founded in the 1700s or so. And there you could go for dinner, and they had a special roast beef plate. And on certain days, you could get as much as you wanted. And so I think I shouldn't speak of the dead, I suppose, but I think I always managed to win the contest in terms of how many roast beef portions I could eat. Unfortunately, the restaurant closed. There's now, I think, at the Logan Airport, there's something that calls itself Durgan Park.
It's true.
But it's nothing like the atmosphere at Durgan Park. I mean, one of the parts of the atmosphere was that the waiters who had been there, I don't know, for 30 years or more, always were very grumpy, and the service was terrible, and they would argue with you and such. It was really a fun place to go, not only for the food, but for the ambience.
That sounds very colorful. So there's a question from the audience. How did you react when you received the Nobel Prize, and what was that the happiest day in your life?
Well, I think I write in the book, the Nobel Prize came as a surprise, not in the sense that I didn't think I deserved it, from the point of view that many people had nominated me for it for over many years. And for a while, I used to sort of listen for the news, particularly when I was in Europe, and the news would come at 11:30 to see whether I had been awarded the prize. Of course, it was sort of silly because I would have been notified earlier before it came on the news. And so I had decided, well, I hadn't gotten the prize after being nominated for so many years. So I was passed by, and that it would never, just wouldn't happen. And so it was really a great surprise when I received the call from Stockholm announcing that I had been awarded the prize. I felt that probably the people who were calling were it was just a trick, knowing that maybe it would be nice to have the prize. And I didn't believe them when they talked to me. We were in the US at the time. And so the call was at 5:30 in the morning, and Marcy, my wife, got up and took it. She said, somebody's calling from Stockholm. And so they went one after the other, congratulating me on the prize, but I didn't really believe it until the secretary of the committee, Astrid, who was a biophysicist, said that I had won the prize, said I finally believed it. But the happiest day of my life, no. I had many happy days. And I thought, well, it was, obviously I was very happy to have received it. And having received it, it certainly played a role in my future. But one thing that when the prize was announced, Harvard had quickly organized a reception at school where, amongst other things, E.J. Corey spoke, another Nobel Prize winner, and he said, how lucky I was that I got the prize so many years later than he did, because it gave me a chance to continue to do research without being bothered. Unlike him, who really, when he was much younger, though I personally don't think it really interfered with his research, but it was something that was sort of an interesting thought, I guess.
That's a great part of the book, Life After the Nobel Prize. So there's a question that touches on your interests in science and cooking that you've discussed, and also you have a great talent and interest in photography and have had many shows, and the book is rich in photographs, I should mention. And this question is, are there common things about science, cooking, and photography that you can see that might explain your interests in those three things?
Well, I think one could argue that there are common themes, but I would say that I was never really interested in the science of cooking as a chemical process. Once in a while, I would look up things that there are books on science of cooking. And photography obviously involves chemistry, both black and white and color photographs, which I mainly took. But if you ask my feeling, is there a connection in my own life that I had with these, that brought these three things together? I think the answer is no. But the interest just developed, and I think there are many people who, who are scientists, not interested in cooking or photography, and say maybe interested in music, where I liked to listen to music, but I never had any talent for music. So I think it is good. I think it's true of many scientists that they do have another interest where they somehow are able to escape, from the science in exercising that interest. I don't know, John, whether you have another special interest like this.
I do, and I think, as you say, most scientists do have many interests. I think you uniquely have very highly developed interests, and that's one of the compelling aspects of your life and this book. We'll have two more questions. So one about science that's forward-looking. You do give a perspective on the vision of science in your book, and this question is: throughout your scientific career, you've worked in several areas of chemistry, and which problems should young computational chemists tackle now?
Well, I think they've sort of come up, I think, working on bigger systems, trying to understand cells and so on, and maybe even organs, given the increased power if quantum computing becomes a reality, I think is one area. The other is to focus on the brain. I mean, it's true nowadays that people are able to record from different neurons in the brain and record hundreds of thousands of data, and understanding this, how to handle this data and get information out of it, is an important problem. And in addition to sort of dealing with big data, which is a popular word nowadays, a big field, and reasonably so, combining the ability to analyze big data with an understanding of the limits that chemistry puts on the interactions between neurons and such, I think could be a very exciting field to work in. And I find that there are a lot of people working on the data handling. I don't think, as far as I know, that anybody's really combining and understanding chemistry with their investigations.
I think that's great advice. So one last question, and it's you made some comments in your introductory remarks that were political, and you have, that's an aspect of this book. You have the wonderful opinion piece that appeared in Haaretz that is there, thinking about the situation in Israel with the Palestinians. And this question speaks to helping mankind, but in asking what the role of science and science education might be. So I know your brother, Robert Karplus, was a distinguished physicist and also a distinguished science educator, and did some very influential work in science education. And you also have been an influential science educator through your textbook and teaching. So the questions are, what do you think should be done to make science education and research more constructive in helping mankind?
Well, this is a question that, like the American Academy of Arts and Sciences wrestles with, how to educate the public, and particularly legislators, to understand problems that are facing us based on a scientific viewpoint. Of course, the most obvious case is climate change, where there's still climate change deniers, including our, for the moment, hopefully, only president. And so scientists could and should try to, depending on their level, either be ready to testify in Congress or act locally to make people aware of the problems in their neighborhoods. I think, like in many things, unless you finally persuade the people, progress is very hard to come by. And so I think that's what scientists should do to improve the possibilities of our planet to continue to be able to have life on it like we've had in the past. Also, making people really willing to make certain sacrifices in terms of driving less, driving hybrid cars, using public transportation, and you can just go on and on. And some, not to mention the present pandemic, where scientists make very clear what is so important in controlling it, and that it's so simple in some ways. I think it would be one thing that would be useful for people to understand is why hand washing is something that's so important, and why you have to do it for 20 minutes. Because one knows how soaps work. They're made up of amphiphilic molecules, where first the hydrophobic part enters the envelope of the virus, and then the hydrophilic part sort of dissolves it essentially in water. And this process takes about 20 seconds or so. And so, if people sort of understood that, I mean, I found that in talking to people about hand washing, that this, they had no idea. They just said, well, they say it's good to wash hands, but having this background, why it's good to wash hands, it's made a big difference to them, and then they go back home and really do it. So there's just a few instances where science and science education can play a role.
That's a beautiful story that shows how understanding molecular science can enrich your life and make you a more thoughtful, informed citizen, and also just a call to all of us to be active broadly as citizens as well as scientists. Well, one of the shortcomings of Zoom is that applause is essentially impossible, but I'd like to thank you for the many participants, Martin, that have enjoyed your comments today about your book. And I would like to now turn this over to you, Bing, for any closing comments.
Thank you, Professor Karplus and Professor Straub, for a wonderful talk. As Professor Gerard Houghton of Harvard puts it, Martin Karplus' memoir is a treasure on two related levels. One is that it describes his rise from being a refugee at age 8 from Nazi tyranny to becoming a great scientist rewarded with a Nobel Prize. On the other level, the book offers the wider story of how modern science at the highest is being done with, in Karplus' case, a humanist worldview. We encourage everyone to give this new book a read. We have now come to the end of today's talk. It has been a pleasure to have all of you. Goodbye.